A whistleblower makes serious allegations about a culture of cover-ups at the US State Department. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Edward Snowden's revelations about the US surveillance state have dominated headlines domestically and internationally. But this week, another whistleblower, Aurelia Fedenisn, made some significant allegations about the US State Department after she turned over documents to a Republican senator. She's alleged that senior State Department officials called off a number of investigations into serious misconduct by State Department employees. Not only that, but the subsequent investigation into the alleged cover-ups was itself subject to a cover-up. Her allegations have created lurid headlines in the US, with suggestions that an ambassador and members of Hillary Clinton's security team hired prostitutes. She also alleges investigations into a drug ring supplying contractors at the US Embassy in Baghdad were quashed. In addition, she says that an investigation into the death of 4 Hondurans, including 2 women, one of whom was pregnant, and a 14-year-old boy last May, who were all shot from a State Department-owned helicopter, was blocked. But what happened in a small village in Honduras was not on the minds of the State Department press corps.
Happy Thursday.
Instead, the administration spokeswoman was repeatedly asked about the more lewd allegations.
The surveillance detection agent in Brussels at the time, according to the memo, quote, determined that the ambassador there routinely ditched his protective security detail in order to solicit sexual favors.
I think we've broadly covered this topic this week, so let me just restate. We're not going to talk about individual cases from the podium. I will say that, again, this memo was put together without the benefit of case files and includes a great deal of unsubstantiated information.
But specific to what those particular agents in the RSO
I'm not
said.
going to speak to, they did not review the case files. I'm not going to speak to individual cases. I'm just making a broad point here that I've made a couple of times in here about this specific memo.
But has anyone in the State Department talked to those members of the protective detail or the RSO
For all of
in
the
past 2
cases
years?
that were in this memo, they were already under review, or they were all already under review. So that applies to all of them,
And
and
review
that means they were
involves-
being looked into.
But that involves speaking to the protective detail members?
It involves a number of efforts to get to the bottom of the facts and look into the details. I'm not going to get into specifically what that means.
To discuss this further, I'm joined by Thomas Pickering. He's a former US ambassador to the United Nations, Russia, India, and Israel. Also in the studio, Jesslyn Radak, National Security and Human Rights Director at the Government Accountability Project. And from Rochester, New York, we're joined by Mark Zaid. He's a lawyer who's represented government whistleblowers. Ambassador Pickering, then, first of all, these allegations of something odd going on at the State Department. There's several things here. First, there are the initial allegations of misconduct, the prostitution, the drug rings in Baghdad and so forth, which, for the purposes of this debate, we're not terribly interested in. Then there are the investigations into those allegations, which it is alleged were lent upon or called off, basically. And then there is the Office of Inspector General report into allegations that the investigations were compromised, which itself did produce a report, but that report itself had been sanitized by the time it was released. I mean, as a former, as a diplomat, as someone who's had a long history at the State Department and elsewhere, I mean, these are pretty worrying allegations about oversight, checks and balances.
Sheila, let me try to respond, because I think that there is a misunderstanding of process here. The Inspector General's office, as I understand it, whenever they get an allegation of criminal behavior, the material is immediately taken out of a regular investigation and put into something called the Office of Investigations. The Office of Investigations has responsibility for criminal investigations. It allows people to have their rights. It conducts it as if it was a criminal investigation in accordance with U.S. criminal law. And it takes the results of that to an assistant U.S. attorney, who then, on the behalf of the Department of Justice, decides whether a prosecution or some other remedy is required in this. And I believe that's what we're seeing here. I have every evidence of every indication that that's what we're seeing.
Well,
the second point, Shia, let me just discuss the process,
okay.
then you can come at me.
Of course.
The second point I understand is that regular reports do not mention individuals and do not discuss criminal behavior. Those are done in the Office of Investigations, with the exception of ambassadors. And ambassadors do appear in regular reports who have committed what are non-criminal offenses or have things to be corrected. I have to tell you that we haven't had an Inspector General of the State Department for many years. Although the acting Inspector General seems to be doing a pretty good job, he's probably had more ambassadors fired than anybody else in the State Department's history as an Inspector General, if that's a mark of good behavior. I still think there are problems. State Department is a reasonably large organization, and it does have problems, and the Inspector General is supposed to clear those up. And one would hope, in fact, that they are doing their job. But this is the way in which I believe they understand the job is to be done.
Right. To take those then, that first stage, and of course you do have the benefit of understanding most of these acronyms, which can be quite perplexing to the rest of us. The first allegation is that initial investigation into whether wrongdoing had been done was basically called off on a number of occasions.
Yeah, and I believe, from what I've been able to determine, that it went to the Office of Investigations rather than being called off.
Right. Well,
it's up to the State Department, I think, to respond to this.
All right. At the very
but
least,
this is what I understand.
And the State Department hasn't really been responding.
No, there was only one statement I saw today.
Then there's the report there into the inquiry into whether those investigations had been called off. Now, the allegation from the whistleblower, Aurelia Fedenisn, is that actually this was completely sanitized to remove the actual specific examples of investigations which had been lent upon.
Well, they apparently involve criminal offenses, and therefore they fall under the Office of Investigations purview rather than the regular part of the Inspector General's office, which does not read rights. And the sense is that the leaking of this information does prejudice their ability to prosecute down the road the people who are guilty.
All right.
And people who are innocent are unfairly labeled by the whistleblower as guilty. So those are side effects, I have to tell you, but I understand them and I can understand the concern.
But what's interesting is there's concern in the allegedly sanitized report itself. The key judgment of the report is the Bureau of Diplomatic Security Special Investigations Division, which investigates allegations of criminal and administrative misconduct.
Yeah, we're not talking about them. We're talking about a different office in the Office of the Inspector General.
I knew this was going to happen with all these.
Yeah, be careful.
But let me run through.
Yeah, but go ahead on
Let me run
sure.
through the key judgment, though.
I'm hearing this for the first time.
Okay, the Bureau of Diplomatic Security Special Investigations Division, which investigates allegations of criminal and administrative misconduct, lacks a firewall to preclude the DS and Department of State hierarchies from exercising undue influence in particular cases.
Yeah.
They're basically saying this is a systemic problem that we do have, whichever perhaps wing of the investigative department.
And that indeed may be true. It isn't the Inspector General's office that lacks the firewall. It's unfortunately the Bureau of Diplomatic Security's office that lacks the firewall. And I don't quibble with that. I accept if the Inspector General said that, that must be true.
Justin, I mean, of course, it's
and I'm not here to plead that everybody is perfectly pure and there's no problem.
But it's fascinating to see the Office of Inspector General himself, which is itself perhaps under fire from a whistleblower, itself conceding, though, that there are real problems with firewalls. Things can be there can be political intervention at the very least, which is interesting in a week where we're having people say, look, people like Snowden on the NSA or Manning for WikiLeaks, they don't need to go to the press. We have checks and balances. But even the Inspector General of the State Department says, no, it's all a bit compromised.
Well, ideally, because of the Inspector General's Act of 1978, we do have Inspector Generals at the agency for whistleblowers to go to. State, as you noted, didn't have one for many years. Obama hadn't bothered to appoint one for, I believe, 7 years. So I'm not sure when these activities occurred.
Yeah,
so
it
I'm
wouldn't
not
quite be 7 years. Let's say 5, because Obama's only been on duty
Right, but
for
under
5
Bush
years.
Wasn't filled
No,
either.
but you can't say Obama failed to appoint one for
sorry,
7
sorry.
years.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, but anyway, there was no Inspector General for quite a period of time, which shows that it doesn't seem to show that the agency cares much about this. I don't know the facts here, but the process...
It's not the agency, of course.
Look,
It's
can
the
you stop interrupting
Inspector
me?
Generals are
Because-
creatures of the Congress.
Ambassador Pickering.
How about
Yeah.
not interrupting me? Because you've done that twice now. But in terms
I just
of
want the
going
truth, that's all.
In terms, I got the truth-telling award, so I think I'm pretty.
Go
good.
on, Justin.
In terms of going to Inspector Generals, everyone says Snowden should have done that. My other NSA client, Thomas Drake, did go through every proper channel, including the General Counsel and the Department of Defense Inspector General, which substantiated his claims. However, they also wrote a report which they immediately classified, so no one could see that his claims of gross illegality and fraud were confirmed. And he also went to 2 House and Senate intel investigations. So he went through every proper channel, and the government turned around and prosecuted him under espionage. All of those counts fell apart as the case completely collapsed. But still, they put the whistleblower through living hell, and that's the judge's words, not mine, because he chose to go through the proper channels.
Mark Zaid, though, you believe in these channels. You believe that the checks and balances are there. You believe the channels are there in which to alert the world to wrongdoing in the government.
Well, the channels are available. I'm not going to say they're going to work every time, and clearly in Thomas Drake's case, they failed. And after doing this for 20 years and representing many of these national security whistleblowers, I can go through a lot of cases where the system failed miserably, and I can go through cases where the system worked. The issue is that one needs to try, I think, to go through the system and act lawfully. One does not just disclose classified information without authorization and decide in their own individual capacity what's in the best national security interest of the United States.
But what about,
so you have to try.
But what about the example then of Thomas Drake, who did stick his head up the parapet, went through the channels that were established, but that made him a target, or the report which we've just received, which we now have from the Office of Inspector General at the State Department, saying there's no firewall. You know, all the higher-ups of the State Department can quash these investigations, and again, that puts any whistleblower into a rather difficult position.
Sure. I mean, look, we're talking about individual cases, and we can come up with examples that worked. We can come up with examples that didn't work. The Drake case was a very specific example, and I think he was treated horribly. I represented one of the witnesses, not in that case, but the person who was going to be one of the primary witnesses to help in the defense on that. And he was the witness in the APAC case too. And the issue was overclassification or misclassification of those. But you know, there are a lot of cases that, depending on how they're going to be, you can go to either an inspector general, you can go to members of Congress, whether a committee that's oversight, or an individual member. You can go to different divisions in departments in the criminal division of justice, whatever, or you can do what I'm doing tomorrow that's gotten some news today, which is to file a lawsuit against the government. I'm filing against the CIA for a covert paramilitary officer. The case is surrounded by classified information, but I went through proper protocols to ensure I filed an unclassified document that contains new information that will enable journalists to now dig around and find out more information. That could have happened in the Drake case. I'm not going to say it would have worked,
We only have 30 seconds
but it could
left.
have.
Justin, that's the point, though. The cases that you highlight are individual cases, but
Well,
by and
I'm
large, the system
representing a
works.
lot of aberrations right now. And by the way, the law is written, you don't have to go through internal channels. If you can, I think that's the preferred route. But it just says an employee who witnesses what he or she believes is fraud, waste, abuse, or illegality may blow the whistle on that. It doesn't say you have to go. It says you can go to Congress first. Sure. You can go through proper channels. There are many different ways. And some cases say that you can go to the media. So the fact that some of these people chose to do that, Drake eventually did do that after the system had failed him. I mean, there's nowhere where it says you must go, you must.
Yeah.
All right, Justin Raydock, thank you very much. Ambassador Pickering, I'm afraid we have to
We're
end
totally in agreement.
Mark Zaid, thank you very much as well.
Thanks. Yeah.
Now, among the revelations from the recent leak of State Department memos is that an investigation into the killing of 4 people in Honduras, including a young boy and 2 women, was quashed. They were shot from State Department helicopters while traveling on a boat carrying 16 people near the Honduran village of Awas last May. Al Jazeera's Kaylin Ford spoke with one of the survivors, Clara Wood, who was in the boat that night. Our report includes some disturbing images.
We left the town of Barapatuca in the evening. The motor was running, working hard against the current for hours. We were about to arrive at the landing when we saw 2 helicopters circling. I was asleep when the shots began from above. I jumped up and shouted out to God, "Where is my son?" But he wasn't in the front of the boat. No one was. I was crying and yelling. I threw myself in the water and swam to the shore. I ran through the woods hoping there weren't venomous snakes. When I got to the landing, the police were there, masked, for my son, crying and shouting. And the police asked me, "What are you doing here at this time of night?" And I said to them, "You already killed my son and the others." When I said that, they grabbed me and searched me. Of course, I didn't have anything. The 4 people who were killed were all sitting in the front of the boat. My son had bullets in his leg, his head, and his stomach. When they finally found him in the river, my son's body was already rotting. They put him on the floor here in my house, and he was full of water. I couldn't see my baby's face anymore. And that's how we had to bury him, in a bag, because I couldn't even bathe him, because he was so swollen and soft. They killed him like he was a dog. This is my furniture I was bringing back with me in the boat that night, full of bullet holes. Drug traffickers don't take their furniture, their tables, their children with them. Anyone can see that we are poor people, that we aren't trafficking drugs. My poor son was only 14 years old. What did he know about narcos? He didn't know anything about that badness. He's with God now. My cousin was in the boat with her 2 little babies. What did they have to do with drug trafficking? My son, he loved to play with me and come over to me, and now no one comes for me. It's been months and months since he hugged me, since he kissed me, and he never will again.
So that was the story of Clara Wood. Let's discuss the significance of the latest disclosures from the State Department about the investigation that did take place, or at least attempted to take place. We're joined from Amherst, Massachusetts by Adrian Pine. She's a professor of anthropology at American University, and she's worked extensively in Honduras. And here in the studio, Alex Main. He's a senior associate from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Alex, before we go into the memo, it's worth remembering, though, that the story up until villagers started speaking out was simply this was a successful DEA raid that killed a few drug traffickers.
Yeah, absolutely. So early in the morning of May 11th, you had a counter-narcotics operation, a joint operation that involved the U.S. DEA and Honduran police that swept into the Awas municipality to try to seize some cocaine shipments that had arrived, and that ended up killing 4 boat passengers in the middle of the Patuca River nearby. And it turns out that these passengers had no apparent links to drug trafficking whatsoever. And they were 2 women. Both seemed to have been pregnant, a 14-year-old boy and a 20-year-old young man. And afterwards, the first reports coming from Honduran authorities was that indeed it was a successful mission, that they had seized cocaine and killed 4 drug traffickers.
But there were lots of demands for an investigation, even from the embassy itself. And now we have this memo, which in fact you've got your hands on, actually, the leaked memo, which actually gives us more of an explanation of what questions actually even the State Department had. Here is that memo, though. Around May 2012, DSICI's SID, so that's the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, became aware through news reporting of a shooting incident in a remote Honduran village by a DEA FAST team, Drug Enforcement Administration FAST team, that resulted in approximately 4 deaths and several injuries. The RSO, Regional Security Officer at the post, was not aware of the incident, as DEA had not reported it. The DEA agents were under Chief of Mission Authority on an INL-funded mission and thus were subject to investigation by the RSO and DSICI-SID in coordination with DEA. Despite requests by the U.S. ambassador to Honduras and congressional pressure, DEA reportedly is not cooperating with the investigation. The case agent interviewed Assistant Secretary for INL William Brownfield, who reportedly was not forthcoming and gave the impression he believed DS should not pursue the investigation. Although SID has provided DEA with the investigative information obtained. To date, DEA has not cooperated with DS, and the investigation cannot proceed further. Lots of letters there, as to be expected, I guess. I mean, there are lots of things, lots of implications then. Alex, first of all, at least they did attempt an investigation. We weren't even sure that had taken place.
We don't know what happened with that investigation, but yes, indeed, the Bureau of Diplomatic Security started looking into this. Obviously, there were a lot of news reports indicating that 4 innocent people had been killed, that there was even an attempt to cover things up. And so there was a small internal investigation, and what they told the Inspector General of the State Department was that they had encountered a lot of obstacles, mainly the DEA not cooperating with the investigation, although the DEA agents that were in Honduras were under the authority of the U.S. ambassador, and that's something that this memo makes clear as well.
But Professor Pine, I mean, from this, it suggests that the U.S. ambassador, under whose authority they were acting, had no clue this was even going on.
Well, it's quite astounding. I mean, we're just finding all of this out, as you mentioned. You just read it, and what this points to is an incredible lack of transparency that is of course increasing insecurity, creating deaths, as in this case, around the world, but which is justified through security. And so, I mean, with all of the whistleblowing going on, we're hearing that this lack of transparency, that we need this sort of politics of a lack of transparency in the State Department and elsewhere to protect our security, but the result is that people are being killed, and we are less and less democratic as a country because we don't have any open information about what's going on.
I mean, that's the point, Alex. I mean, the initial administration account then proved to be false, or at least appears to be false. I mean, these don't appear to be that child did not appear to be a drug trafficker. Any investigation that was undertaken clearly has been stymied, though. Even when the State Department checks and balances are in place, it's actually a high official in the State Department, William Brownfield, Assistant Secretary for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, who's the one who's saying, we don't want this.
Well, that's certainly what's reported in this memo, and we don't know what happened afterwards, if that was afterwards investigated by the Inspector General of the State Department at all. We simply don't know what happened afterwards. But just getting back to what you were saying earlier, I think one of the key points in all of this is the role of the DEA in the operation. Again, there were 10 DEA agents that were present during this operation. There were 4 State Department helicopters equipped with mounted guns. Apparently one of those helicopters opened fire on the boat. And this is something that the State Department and the DEA seem very, very adamant about keeping quiet.
Very quickly, Alex, as we were going to air, though, William Brownfield did make a comment. What did he say?
Well, he denied that he had tried to thwart this investigation anyway, and said, in fact, that he had tried to get the DEA and the State Department to coordinate and cooperate on investigation. But this is exactly the opposite of all of the messages received from both the DEA and the State Department, where they've said there's no need for an investigation because the Honduras authorities have made one. It turns out that is...
Did that exonerate the State Department, as the State Department claims?
It did not. It did not. And also, it was a very flawed investigation. This is something that our organization in Rights Action looked at very carefully, and we saw that the report was very flawed and had omissions of key testimony that would actually indicate that the DEA played a central role in the entire operation. Did they even get to
check the helicopter, the State Department helicopter, with the
they were unable to
heavy
check,
caliber guns
They were
mounted
unable
on
to check the helicopters. They were unable to interview any of the DEA agents that were present in the operation. They were unable to perform any sort of forensic tests on the weapons of those agents.
Professor Pine, as in the remaining time we have, then link this up to us. Give us the broader context. I mean, there are so many questions about this operation at a time when the State Department, the DEA, Special Ops perhaps, are doing more and more in Central America with local police forces, local security forces. Are you confident that there is the oversight, the checks and balances then that we need at this time of such activity?
Well, it's clear that there aren't the checks and balances that we need. I mean, the congressional members wrote a Dear Colleague letter that was in support of an investigation, and they were just ignored by the State Department. That happened earlier this year. And the U.S. is pouring more and more money, hundreds of millions of dollars, through CARSI, the Central American Regional Security Initiative, which is militarizing the entire region, justified through a discourse of security and the drug war, and in fact creating more and more insecurity throughout the region. And we as United States citizens and even our Congress members are not able to keep it in check or to even find out what's going on.
Professor Adrian Pine, thank you very much. Alex Main, thank you very much as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.